Operation Hydra, Polish espionage versus Hitler's V1 and V2. The night from August 17th to 18th was clear. In the moonlight, nearly 600 British Lancaster and Halifax heavy bombers could easily be seen flying over Uznam Island. Their target was the research center at Peenemünde, an almost unknown one, or so the pilots knew. At the pre-raid meeting, Marshal Arthur Harris, the bomber commander, had said, among other things, that if the objective was not destroyed the first time, the flights would be repeated until the mission was accomplished. What the mysterious research center actually was, only a few officers knew. At Peenemünde, Germany was testing one of Hitler's wonder weapons, the V1 and V2 rockets, which were supposed to change the fate of the war. The British command had, therefore, to prepare the attack on this objective very carefully. As part of the strategy, British planes had begun bombing Berlin long before the start of Operation Hydra, the code name for the action at Peenemünde. Until now, however, they had flown on a different route, along the shore of the Baltic Sea, above the island of Uznam, and only after that they turned towards Berlin. The capital of Germany was attacked, including on the night of August 17th to 18th, to be sure that the German aviators would be busy defending it. At 2000 hours, on August 17th, the first planes took off from London and, after a few hours, they were over Uznam Island. We flew over the three main targets set to be bombed: the construction plant, the missile assembly sections, and the residential area, recalls John Searby, the raid commander. I noticed that smoke was coming out of hundreds of canisters placed by the Germans, which the wind from the sea was carrying towards our targets. The Germans tried to hide them from us. Suddenly, the whole area was bathed in a bright light as the first wave of Pathfinders, wartime British Air Force target marking planes, passed over Peenemünde, leaving behind its Christmas trees, which headed for the ground in waterfalls. The first to fall were the red rockets, which indicated the targets of the bombardment. Immediately after them came the yellow rockets, followed by the green ones, the last ones, and at the same time the ones that indicated exactly the objective that had to be destroyed. At that moment, by radio, I ordered the approaching bombers to start the action, primarily on the points marked by the green rockets. Only then did Peenemünde gradually acquire the familiar image of an objective, the target of a massive air attack. The bombs exploding, the clouds of smoke disintegrating, the glimmering lights of the searchlights, the red fire of the anti-aircraft guns, the whole bombed area suddenly changed. It was hell on earth. An explanation is necessary. The Allies then used a new tactic. The raid was opened by a master bomber, which rotated above the objective and transmitted by radio the following targets that had to be destroyed, these being, in turn, highlighted by luminous signs, Christmas trees, about which Searby wrote, by the Pathfinder planes, which also indicated the direction to follow. The destruction at Peenemünde was extensive, with most of the bombs falling in the area where the researchers lived. However, the assembly halls escaped almost untouched. It must be added that the Allies also bombed the barracks of the detainees who worked here. On the way back to the base, the bombers were attacked by several dozen German fighter planes coming from Berlin. The Germans managed to destroy 42 planes. Wunderwaffe, Hitler's wonder weapon. The initial V comes from the German word Vergeltungswaffe, which means counterattack weapon. The V1 was, in fact, a flying bomb launched from a special device and remotely controlled by an autopilot type system equipped with 3 gyroscopes. Propulsion was provided by a gasoline-powered reaction engine. The flying bomb was 8.4 meters long. It was equipped with 2 wings, whose opening measured 5.4 meters and weighed 2,160 kilograms, of which 600 kilograms of Toluene explosive formed by a nitrogen derivative of toluene and ammonium nitrate, and 700 liters of fuel. The V1 could reach a maximum speed of 580 kilometers per hour and could rise to an altitude of 600 to 1,000 meters up to a maximum of 3,000 meters. In contrast, the V2 was a long-range, liquid-fueled ballistic missile. Its creator was Werner von Braun, the father of German rocket technology. German scientists have been trying to build this type of projectile since the 1920s. Professor Hermann Oberth, born in Transylvania, and Cebu, Rudolf Nebel, Klaus Riedel, and many others, including Werner von Braun, were involved in this operation. In Reinickendorf and Kummersdorf, test sites for these rockets were created, and in 1930 a prototype rocket was launched. A year later they built an engine based on liquid fuel. Naturally, the inventions attracted the attention of the military, and that's when von Braun's rapid career began. Commander of the ballistic section of the Dry Army, Lieutenant Colonel Engineer Karl Emil Becker received from his superiors the task of organizing the group of scientific researchers who had to carry out, for the benefit of the Army, several tests on rockets powered by liquid fuel. Becker knew Werner von Braun, who had been good friends with his father, Magnus. He proposed to him the collaboration, and von Braun accepted without any hesitation. It should be mentioned, however, that, leaving his former collaborators, von Braun took with him their ideas and inventions up until then. In 1933, von Braun built a rocket called Aggregate 1. It was relatively small and was only used for ground tests. The next model, Aggregate 2, took off. The traction force of the engine was 300 kilograms. These successes brought funds, which were used to build the next prototype, Aggregate 3, 5 meters long, 75 centimeters in diameter, 1,500 kilograms of engine traction. When the rearmament of Germany was in full swing, von Braun's erstwhile protectors strove to ensure that he did not lack funds for research. Becker's promotion to the rank of lieutenant general in the Ministry of War undoubtedly made it easier for him to obtain them. He also managed to co-interest the decision-makers in missile research, including the Commander-in-Chief of the Dry Army, Werner von Fritsch, and the head of the experimental section of the Air Ministry, Wolfram Freiherr von Richthofen, a cousin of the famous Red Baron, the ace of German aviation in the First World War. Thanks to them and the state money, in 1936 the construction of the Peenemünde Center began, which historian David Irving said was the most modern experimental station in the world at the time. The action was kept secret, and that is precisely why Peenemünde was chosen. The town is located on the island of Uznam, in the Szczecin Lagoon complex, in a rather isolated area. Polish espionage on the trail of the Wunderwaffe. Most likely in 1942, the Armia Krajowa, Polish National Army, received in London the first report on the German experiments with the new weapon. More interesting is that the British already knew about these tests for several years, from the so-called Oslo Report. At the very beginning of the war, the British military attaché in the capital of Norway had received an anonymous letter, which mentioned, among other things, the German base at Peenemünde on the island of Uznam in the Baltic Sea, where missiles were being tested. The British, however, considered this information as a German provocation and, consequently, did not take an interest in this matter for the next few years. On the other hand, several Polish espionage cells operated in Pomerania, subordinate to the Stragin Offensive Espionage Network. In 1942, when it was destroyed by the Gestapo and Polish espionage reorganized, its missions were taken over by the branch codenamed Lombard. Information about the Peenemünde base and missiles reached the center already in 1941, but it was quite general. Only this much was known: on the island of Uznam there is a German research center, very well guarded, where a secret weapon is being tested. One of the earliest surviving reports of these rockets is dated February 9, 1943. The experiments at Peenemünde were successful. There is a missile test site there. The missiles will be attached to the bombers. Threatened by the pursuing planes, they will launch the missiles and, thanks to them, they will move away quickly and thus they will not be able to catch up. Those at the center were interested in this news and ordered the collection of additional data. The request was repeated several times. All possible information was collected, from details of the missiles tested to plans for their use. A special intelligence cell was in charge of collecting and analyzing them, led before the war by the engineer Antoni Kochjan, a well-known builder. The reports prepared in Warsaw were then sent to London. The following information about the secret weapon made the English take action. At the head of the Commission for the Study of German Secret Weapons was Duncan Sandys, former commander of the Experimental Missile Regiment of the Anti-Aircraft Artillery, secretary in the Ministry of Supply, and, in particular, Churchill's son-in-law. He set to work and quickly put together the right team to analyze all the information about Peenemünde. Sandys particularly wanted photographs, so the RAF began flying reconnaissance flights over Uznam Island. In May, he already sent Churchill the first report on V weapons, according to which Germany had been working for a long time on a long-range missile, but the document acknowledged that detailed information on this subject was still lacking, so the flights of recognition continued. Not long after that, the English managed to be the first to photograph a V-1 rocket, although they didn't quite know what it represented. In June, they identified another unknown object in the photos, the V-2 rocket. The information gathered by Sandys was enough for British generals to realize that the danger of a German Wunderwaffe, wonder weapon, attack was real, with Marshal Alan Brooke himself, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, warning Churchill about it. After one of the meetings with the Prime Minister, they decided to bomb Peenemünde as quickly as possible. The Porter, the Cart, and others. At the request of the British, in the spring of 1943, Polish espionage intensified its actions to gather information about V weapons. The network was created by the agent Stefan Ignazak, known as the Nordic. The Baltica Group, led by Bernard Kaczmarek, codenamed Blackbeard, was also involved in the same action. The main source of information about the island of Uznam turned out to be a certain Jan Schroeder, also known as Karudasol, an informant for the Poles, employed in Świnoujście at the company that delivered food to Peenemünde. From his accounts, the agents learned that the western part of the island was separated from the rest by a barbed wire fence, and those who lived there could not theoretically leave the area. And that was not all. The entire island was divided into sectors, separated by successive zones of control, and movement between them was limited. The wagoner also told them about the rumors circulating among the German locals, from which it appeared that new rockets, which were like smaller planes, would be tested at Peenemünde. This information was quickly confirmed. The new and very valuable source was Roman Traeger, a soldier from a Wehrmacht transmission subunit, transferred to Peenemünde. However, it must be mentioned that everything happened as a result of extremely favorable circumstances. Here's why. Roman's father, Augustin, an Austrian with German citizenship, had been the head of the conspiratorial organization in Pomerania called the Sword and the Plough. He was known under the pseudonym the Porter and collaborated with the intelligence service of the National Army. He led the Baltica III subgroup. When his son told him about Peenemünde, Hamelul arranged a meeting with the Blackbeard. Not only did the young Traeger confirm all of Karatasaloo's information, but he also began to collaborate with Polish espionage as an agent under the pseudonym T2S. He later passed on the information about the experimental rockets, which resembled smaller planes and were launched into the air from special devices. Moreover, he made a sketch of the Peenemünde base. The report in question was sent first to Warsaw and from there to London. Armed with valuable information gathered by Polish intelligence and photo analysis by Sandys' team, the British set the Peenemünde bombing on the night of August 17th to 18th. But, as I said at the beginning, the production halls and warehouses remained almost untouched after this first attack. As a result, the investigations at Peenemünde continued, and the British asked for new information. In November 1943, the Organization of the National Army in Pomerania sent the following report to Warsaw. The Germans finished the experiments with the new weapon and moved very quickly to mass production. They are missiles with a length of 4 meters and a diameter of 1 meter, launched from catapults mounted on destroyers, with a range of 30 kilometers. They can also be launched from airplanes, in which case the consequences are unknown to me. This weapon is to be used against England. The experiments ended with very good results. Other reports also informed about the start of production of the rockets, some containing their drawing and description, as well as the information that the Germans are installing a launcher for the V-1 in the Calais region. In June 1944, the first flying bomb was dropped on London. Over the next few months, more than 10,000 such rockets fell on the British capital and other cities, 10,000 people died, and more than 20,000 were injured. Scar. Even though the Scientific Research Center at Peenemünde continued to function, the Germans wanted to protect themselves against further possible raids. Only a few days after the bombing, during a meeting at Hitler's secret headquarters in Wilczek, Wolf's Lair, it was decided to transfer the activities to several different centers. The test site was moved to Blizna, a village in the Podkarpackie Voivodeship, a region located in the southeast of Poland. The place was not chosen by chance. Nearby was the village of Pusko, where there was an SS training ground and a forced labor camp. A little further to the north, there was a Wehrmacht training ground, and to the east, an aviation one. Most of the locals were displaced, leaving only the foresters and those who agreed to work in the landfill. However, this place also had another advantage: it was outside the range of Allied bombers. The Germans could therefore consider that the Blizna Pusko camp was completely safe. However, it wasn't quite like that. The Pusko camp was from the beginning supervised by the local branch of the National Army, which was very well organized. The first information started coming in quite quickly. In November and December 1943, the Krakow Center repeated and reports the information that in the SS training camp in the town of Blizna Pusko, not far from the town of Mielec, the Germans strengthened control. They fired part of the Polish workers employed in the area, and part of the camp was additionally surrounded with barbed wire, recalled Colonel Kazimierz Irenek Ozmecki, who shortly took over the head of the Intelligence Bureau of the National Army. Soon new news arrived. Like, for example, some secret transports started coming to the camp on the railway. The cargo was brought in closed wagons, much longer than the usual ones, reinforced with a special construction and fed from tanks, different from the normal ones. Photographs of the train loads were submitted, but they didn't say much. All we could do was recognize the loads similar to the fuselage of an airplane, but no more than that. Setting up the Blizna camp went quickly. Until the fall of 1943, the population was displaced. The launch pad, fuel storage and technical warehouses for the use of rockets, as well as the assembly hall, were built on the abandoned lands. The electricity and water supply networks were executed, roads, a narrow-gauge railway and an airstrip for light aircraft were built. 3 German military units were stationed in the training ground, experimental artillery batteries for Cadets 444 and 485 and Artillery Detachment 836. Later they would be sent to France in search of the remains of the rocket. In November 1943, the Germans unsuccessfully conducted the first experiment with a V-2 rocket, which crashed immediately after takeoff. Over the next few months, nearly 60 more missiles were launched, but only 4 of them hit their intended targets. The rest crashed in the nearby woods. The National Army quickly began to keep records of the flights, but it was difficult, during this entire period, to determine exactly what the Germans were doing. They carefully collected the remains of the rockets and did not allow anyone access to the area where they were falling. For example, at Sarnaki on the Bug, one of the objectives of the tests, a special search detachment was stationed. However, Polish intelligence prepared a large-scale action to collect the remains of the rockets, in which the local population also got involved. Tadeusz Jakubski, also called the Black, organized a very well-established network in the area. I knew the terrain very well and therefore knew that there was no trace of artillery, so where did the explosions come from? The secret was quickly revealed when I received the first report. I immediately went to the place of the explosion, where the Germans had not yet arrived. I collected with the help of my subordinates a number of materials such as electric motors, coils of wire, tanks of an unknown liquid which, when leaked and came into contact with air, burned even sand, torn aluminum sheets and whole bunches of electric wires. The information put together confirmed our opinion that we were dealing with the new German missile. Knowing the activity of the National Army in the area, the Germans tried to deceive the local population, spreading manifestos with the text, "Attention, this is not a bomb," and with the explanation that sometimes the planes dropped the empty fuel tanks here, ordering at the same time that such objects found should be brought immediately to the nearest police station or airport. In addition to collecting the remains of the rockets, the Poles were gathering information about the place of launches, the bringing of the projectiles, about the components and fuel, as well as about the effects of the explosions. The National Army continued to receive news about what was happening in the Blizna training ground. A valuable informant was, among others, Stefan Swiderski, also known as the Brave, a prisoner of the Blizna Commando. It also happened that the Germans said many things by themselves. Josef Kisiel, also known as the Plow, the head of the brewery in Sarnaki, learned from a drunken German non-commissioned officer that missiles were being tested in the region of the city of Mielek, which were to be used in the bombing of London. More than that, the German drew him the sketch of a rocket. Other valuable information was provided by the commander of the unit stationed at Sarnaki, Lieutenant Schroeder, who also loved the drink. The recovered fragments were sent to Warsaw, where they were analyzed by Kochjan and his men. By May 1944, many materials had been gathered, but, nevertheless, the construction of the rocket still remained an unknown. The National Army had already begun to prepare an action to obtain a missile. They considered attacking a train carrying such projectiles, which soon proved to be no longer necessary. The Poles managed to recover a rocket that had fallen into the Bug River and then had not exploded. She was whole. Operation Most 3. Preparations for removing the rocket from the water and transporting it to Warsaw began immediately. The operation was not easy, especially since the Germans were constantly patrolling the area. Over the course of several nights, under the close supervision of specialists sent from the capital, it was possible to dismantle the rocket and then send the component parts to Warsaw. The tireless Kochjan and his team took care of their analysis. Almost every day they learned new details about the construction and operation of the rocket, and the mails for London left more often than before. The Poles continued to monitor the training ground in Blizna. They noticed, for example, that the rockets, once launched, follow a certain trajectory in the air. The hypothesis was thus confirmed that the transmission devices from the radio receiving device discovered near Sarnaki could be used to guide the projectile to the desired point through a ground station, recalled Irenek Osmeki. Therefore, the Poles decided to build their own station and thus try to take control of the trajectory of a V-2 missile. The British were very interested in this information. After the radio dialogue between Warsaw and London, it was established that this device, as well as others, will be sent to the British capital by courier, added Irenek Osmeki. Operation Most 3 was organized to transport the fragments of the V-2 rocket to London. Previously, two other operations had taken place, Most and Most 2, in April and May 1944, and, as a result of the success achieved, the command decided to organize a third one. On the night of July 25 to 26, 1944, a British Dakota transport plane landed at Model Airport near Tarnow, with 4 agents on board, equipped with weapons, explosives, and 5 radio stations. On the way back, in addition to the precious parts of the rocket, they also took 5 people with them. Among them, Jerzy Shimolewski Raphael, the head of the Bureau of Industrial Studies, who carried the report on the V-2 missile. London thus received extremely valuable information, thanks to which research on the Wunderwaffe could go forward. Activity at the Blizna test site was coming to an end. At the end of June and the beginning of July, before the organization of the Most 3 operation, the Germans decided to move to the training ground at Heidkraut in the Tucholsky Woods, not far from the town of Weierstusen. The evacuation was dictated by the proximity of the front and the desire of the Germans to leave before the arrival of the Red Army. What they could not carry would be destroyed. Learning this, the Poles decided to act. At the beginning of July, the partisan detachments, led by Alexander Rusin, alias Ruzel, Josef Wallach, alias Zbik, Wild Cat, and the Ladislaw Korsheny, alias Swierst, Cricket, attacked the training ground at Blizna. The Poles secured, among other things, the launch pads of the rockets, the one for the V-2 being already damaged. The Germans counterattacked and, for a short time, reoccupied the training ground. Eventually, the Poles gained control of the Blizna range, which they held until the arrival of the Soviet Army in early August. Polish espionage and Allied victory. Solving the mystery of the German V-missiles or breaking the Enigma code are the most famous successes of Polish espionage during the Second World War. But not the only ones. Before the war, the intelligence services were subordinated to the II section of the Polish Army's General Staff. During the evacuation, almost all of its personnel left the country, together with the authorities of the Republic of Poland, and in exile the intelligence structures were quickly rebuilt. Already in November 1939, the Prime Minister and Supreme Commander, General Sikorsky, decided to reorganize the espionage services, at the same time starting collaboration with similar French services. Officers and non-commissioned officers, most of them from the former branch No. 3 and Bydgoszcz, which, before the war, spied on the Germans, were directed to the intelligence services of the French Navy. The Bureau of Ciphers, the so-called Group Z, led by Colonel Guido Langer and Major Maximilian Sieski, also collaborates with the French services. However, the cooperation was not among the best, because the French did not see the need for closer cooperation and underestimated the Poles, treating them with contempt. For example, in the spring of 1940, Polish agents in Romania and Hungary reported to Paris that the Germans were probably preparing to attack the West, but the French ignored these reports. At that time, the organization of connections with occupied Poland had already begun. The creation of communication lines was handled by the information centers in Bucharest, Budapest, Stockholm, and Paris, with smaller branches operating along them. On December 24, 1939, the Regina radio station began broadcasting from Paris, the next, in April 1940, from Angers, and 2 months later the secret station from Warsaw. After the defeat of France, the Polish government and army were evacuated to Great Britain. Together with them, the leadership of the intelligence services was in London. Another reorganization followed. Section 2 was directly subordinated to the Supreme Commander Sikorsky, and after 1942, to the Commander of the Grand Staff. In 1940, the Poles concluded a cooperation agreement with the British Intelligence Service. Although the British had a fairly extensive espionage network, due to the preparations for war starting too late, they still had a lot to recover. Jacques Colville, Winston Churchill's secretary, believed that British espionage cannot give accurate information about the movements of the German fleet or army. Colville later stated that during the war Polish espionage was the best. General William Donovan, the creator of the American Spy Service, Office of Strategic Services, precursor of the Central Intelligence Agency, had the same words of appreciation. The weakness shown by the British service meant that every time London collaborated with the Poles very well. It should be noted, however, that this cooperation was rather one-sided, the historian Jan Sichanowski being of the opinion that the British were inclined to treat Polish espionage as part of their own service. First of all, because, to a good extent, the British intelligence service financed the Poles. According to the signed cooperation agreement, the Polish agents had to transmit the information obtained to the British, receiving in return synthetic reports. In addition, the British service tasked the Poles with concrete missions. These ranged from gathering information on the deployment of German armies, plans to strike Great Britain and the USSR, continuing with transport or war production, to reports on the morale of German soldiers. Even if, in December 1941, leaving the position of head of British intelligence, General Beaumont Nesbitt declared appreciatively that Polish espionage greatly helps the British command throughout Europe, the head of the 2 Division, Colonel Leon Mickiewicz, had no illusions about the intentions to the British. To sum up, in the Department of Secret Intelligence they see their own interest, and that is why they stick to us like this. 45% of the secret information available to the Allies came from Polish agents. The British were especially interested in the situation in Germany, their information network in this part of the continent being greatly weakened after the occupation of Central and Western Europe by Hitler. By mid-1942, they estimated that more than 80% of the Polish reports contained useful information. Historians estimate that 45% of the secret information available to the Allies during the war came from Polish agents. From July 1942 to June 1943, the Poles sent the British more than 7,000 reports, data on the deployment of German military units, troop transport, aviation, navy, as well as secret information from North Africa, more than 1,000 reports about agents of various foreign services, 800 reports processed by the Polish Intelligence Service, 235 reports on Polish disinformation activity, Action D. A year later, the number of reports based on intercepted German messages rose to 29,500. The British rated them as extremely valuable, 25%, very valuable, 60%, and valuable, 12%. As mentioned, the British were most interested in intelligence from Germany and the occupied countries, so it was important for them to work with the National Intelligence Service, carried out by the Union of Armed Struggle, Związek Walki Zbrojnych ZWZ, the name of the Polish Armed Forces, between November 13, 1939 to February 14, 1942, later becoming Armia Krajowa, and, later, the National Army, Armia Krajowa. However, if, for example, in 1943, almost 10,500 various materials and information arrived in London from Poland, only 1,697 were sent in the opposite direction. In occupied Poland, the intelligence services were under the second section of the Supreme Command of the National Army. The intelligence structures began to be organized very quickly. At the end of September 1939, Major Edmund Gallinet already arrived in Warsaw as an envoy of the Supreme Commander, Marshal Edward Rydz Smigly, with the mission of organizing the resistance movement. The first conspiratorial organization was Służba Zwycięstwa Polski, SZP, Service for the Victory of Poland, and the Espionage Service was organized by Major Wacław Burke, alias Wacław. After the dissolution of the SZP and the creation of Związek Walki Zbrojnych, ZWZ, Union of Armed Struggle, in its place, Wacław held the post of head of the National Intelligence Services. According to the statement of the head of the ZWZ, General Stefan Rowecki, alias Grot, Arrowhead, the intelligence services must know everything that happens with the enemy, because nowadays all the activities concerning the conduct of the war influence not only the news about the war itself, but in the supply of the army and the civilian population, the state of the economy, the morale of the troops and civilians, as well as police affairs. In London, the 6th Section of the General Staff of the Supreme Commander, which later became the Special Section, was in charge of maintaining the connection with occupied Poland. This is done by means of parachute couriers or by radio. In the middle of 1944, few communication routes were functioning. The journey from Warsaw to London took from a few weeks to a few months. The shortest way was through Stockholm, but the safest way, paradoxically, can cross practically the whole of Europe, through Germany, France, Spain, and Portugal. In the end, we are left with a bitter observation. It is true that the British evaluated the information received from Section 6 as extremely valuable, but many times they arrogated to themselves successes of Polish espionage, presenting them as their own successes. And, more seriously, some information was considered exaggerated or false in London, such as those about the gas chambers or the Holocaust. Also, regarding the V missiles, the British did not believe the Polish reports, which some of the officers considered the product of Goebbels's propaganda, even after the Peenemünde bombing.